Commander Veltar pressed his scaled hands against the cold metal of the observation deck window and stared at the sight that haunted his dreams. Red ships filled the space around his home planet like angry wasps around a broken nest. The hegemony fleet had been there for 3 months now, and every day they grew bolder in their attacks. New Haven had been such a beautiful world when his people first found it 200 years ago. Green forests covered most of the land, and blue oceans sparkled under the light of twin suns. The Zephyrians had built their cities carefully, making sure to protect the natural beauty that had drawn them here. Children played in parks filled with flowering trees that changed colors with the seasons. Markets buzzed with the sound of families buying fresh food and handmade goods. All of that was gone now. The bombardment had started small at first, just a few plasma blasts hitting empty areas far from the cities. The hegemony wanted to scare them, not destroy everything right away. Fear was their favorite weapon because scared people gave up faster than dead ones. But when the Zephyrians refused to surrender, the attacks got worse. Veltar watched another flash of red light streak down from the hegemony ships toward the planet below. He knew that flash meant another building was gone, maybe a school or a hospital or homes where families had lived for generations. The impact would shake the ground for miles around and leave a crater where something important used to be. His communication officer, Sub-Commander Kixara, walked up beside him with a data pad in her hands. Her blue scales had lost their shine over the past months and her eyes looked tired. Everyone looked tired these days. Sleep was hard to find when you never knew if the next explosion would be close enough to kill you. The Eastern District took another hit an hour ago, she said in a quiet voice. Medical Center 7 is gone. Dr. Yelvis managed to get most of the patients out before the building collapsed, but we lost 12 people. Veltar closed his eyes and felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a heavy stone. 12 more names to add to the list that already had thousands of entries. 12 more families who would never be complete again. 12 more reasons why he needed to find a way to save his people. What about the council? He asked without opening his eyes. Any word from the emergency session? Kixara shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Ambassador Telnock sent another message yesterday. The Galactic Council is still debating whether our situation qualifies as a legitimate humanitarian crisis or just a territorial dispute. They want to form a committee to study the matter further. The words hit Veltar like a physical blow. A committee to study the matter. His people were dying, and the great powers of the galaxy wanted to have meetings about whether they deserved help. The council chambers were probably comfortable and safe, far from the sound of explosions and the smell of burning buildings. The representatives could take their time debating while Zephyrian children hid in underground shelters, jumping at every sound. How long do we have? Veltar asked. Our best estimates say the shields around the main population centers will fail in 2 weeks, maybe less. The hegemony is hitting them harder every day, and our power generators can't keep up with the demand. Once the shields go down, Kixara didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Veltar had seen what happened to colonies that lost their shields. The hegemony didn't believe in quick deaths. They would level the cities block by block, making sure the survivors watched their world die slowly. Then they would demand surrender and turn the broken population into slaves to work their mines and factories. The Zephyrians had always been a peaceful people. They explored the stars not to conquer but to learn and discover. Their ships carried scientists and artists, not soldiers and weapons. When they met other species, they offered friendship and knowledge. They had never imagined that their peaceful nature would make them targets. The hegemony was different. They believed that strength came from taking what others had built. Their ships were designed for war, and their soldiers were trained from childhood to see conquest as the highest honor. They looked at peaceful species like the Zephyrians and saw weakness to be exploited. Sir, Kixara said carefully, Admiral Crexiton has requested another meeting with you. He says his terms are still generous. Veltar felt anger rise in his chest like hot metal. Admiral Crextan commanded the hegemony fleet, and he sent surrender demands every few days like clockwork. His terms were always the same. Total surrender, complete disarmament and relocation of the entire population to work camps on hegemony worlds. He called it generous because he promised not to execute more than 10% of the population as an example to others. Tell Admiral Crexton that my answer remains the same, Veltar said. We would rather die free than live as slaves. But even as he said the words, Veltar wondered how much longer he could keep saying them. Every day brought new reports of damage, New casualty lists. New systems failing under the constant bombardment. The population was losing hope, and some had already started asking if surrender might be better than watching their children starve in underground bunkers. The worst part was the silence from the rest of the galaxy. The Zephyrians had sent distress calls to every major power, every friendly species, every organization that claimed to care about peace and justice. Most never responded at all. Those that did sent polite messages expressing concern and promising to bring the matter up at the next scheduled council session in 6 months. 6 months. His people would be dead or enslaved long before then. Commander, a voice called from across the observation deck. Junior Officer Nex Ali hurried toward them with another data pad. We're getting some kind of transmission from outside the system. It's very weak and the signal is badly damaged, but it seems to be directed at us. Veltar felt a tiny spark of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe one of their distress calls had finally reached someone who cared. Maybe help was actually coming. Can you clean up the signal? He asked. We're trying, sir, but most of our long-range communication equipment was destroyed in last week's attack. This might be all we can get. The 3 officers gathered around a small communication console as Nexali worked to filter out as much static as possible. The voice that emerged was clearly alien, speaking Galactic Standard with an accent none of them recognized. This is United Earthship, to any survivors. Your distress signal. Help is coming. Hold on to the transmission cutoff, leaving them staring at the silent console. Earth. Veltar searched his memory for what he knew about that distant world. Humans, a young species that had only joined the galactic community recently. Their technology was considered primitive by most standards, and their homeworld was far out on the galactic rim. Weeks of travel even with the fastest ships. Earth? Kixara said with confusion in her voice. But they're nobody. What could they possibly do against a hegemony battle fleet? Veltar didn't have an answer, but for the first time in months he felt something other than despair. Someone had heard their call for help. Someone cared enough to respond. It might not be enough to save them, but at least they would not die completely alone and forgotten. He looked back out the window at the red ships that surrounded his dying world and made a silent promise. If help was really coming, he would make sure his people survived long enough to see it arrive. Admiral Jake Morrison sat in his office at Fleet Command reading the same message for the 3rd time. The translation from Zephyrian had taken 2 days to complete, and the words still seemed impossible to believe. 70 million people trapped on a planet, while an enemy fleet slowly killed them from orbit. Children hiding in underground shelters while their world burned above them. The message had traveled through 17 different relay stations to reach Earth. By the time it arrived, it was already 3 weeks old. For all Morrison knew, the Zephyrian colony might already be gone. But something in the desperate tone of the transmission made him believe they were still fighting, still hoping someone would care enough to help. Morrison had spent 40 years in the Terran Defense Fleet, working his way up from a young lieutenant to admiral of the 3rd Fleet. He had seen humanity's first contact with alien species, watched as Earth joined the galactic community, and learned how politics worked among the stars. Most of the time, it wasn't pretty. The big powers talked about peace and cooperation, but they only acted when their own interests were threatened. The Galactic Council was good at making speeches about justice, but terrible at actually doing something when innocent people needed help. Morrison had watched them debate for months about trade disputes while entire colonies disappeared from the star maps. But this was different. This wasn't about trade routes or mining rights. This was about families trying to survive while their planet died around them. Morrison had children of his own, grandchildren too. When he closed his eyes, he could imagine them hiding in dark bunkers, scared and hungry, waiting for help that might never come. He pressed the button on his desk communicator. Get me President Barnes. Tell her it's urgent. 20 minutes later, Morrison stood in the Situation Room deep beneath the White House. President Lisa Barnes sat at the head of a long table surrounded by advisors who looked like they'd been pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. The holographic display in the center of the room showed the Kepler 442 system. 37 light-years from Earth. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, said Secretary of Defense Robert Kim. You want to send our entire battle fleet to help a species we barely know, fight an enemy that could destroy us. Morrison nodded. That's exactly what I'm proposing, sir. General Chris Martinez leaned forward in his chair. Admiral, I respect your compassion, but we have to think strategically. The Zephyrians have never supported us in council votes. They've never offered us any kind of alliance. Why should we risk our ships and our people for them? Because it's the right thing to do, Morrison said simply. The room fell silent. Morrison could see the advisors looking at each other, probably thinking he was naive or foolish. They were politicians and generals who understood power and interests. They made decisions based on what would benefit humanity, not what would help strangers on the other side of the galaxy. President Barnes studied the star map floating above the table. She was younger than Morrison, only 52 years old, but she had already proven herself to be a strong leader. When the Centauri trade war had threatened to drag Earth into a conflict that could have destroyed human civilization, she had found a peaceful solution that satisfied everyone. "What are our chances?" she asked quietly. Morrison appreciated that she asked about chances, not whether they should go. "Honestly, Madam President, not good. The Hegemony fleet has 50 ships including heavy cruisers and battleships. We can field maybe 26 combat vessels if we pull everything from patrol duties and training missions. So we'd be outnumbered 2-1, said General Martinez. "Yes, sir. But our ships are faster and our crews train harder. The Hegemony relies on overwhelming firepower in direct confrontation. They're not used to fighting enemies who think differently than they do." Secretary of State Karen Phillips shook her head. "Even if we could win, which seems unlikely, the political consequences would be severe. We'd be acting without council authorization, interfering in what they'll call an internal matter. It could damage our relationships with every major power in the galaxy." Morrison felt frustration building in his chest. "With respect, Madam Secretary, what relationships? The Council ignores us unless they need something. The major powers treat us like children who should be grateful just to be allowed at the table. When has playing by their rules ever gotten us anything except empty promises?" President Barnes stood up and walked to the holographic display. She studied the image of New Haven, the Zephyrian colony world that was slowly dying under enemy bombardment. Morrison wondered what she was thinking. As president, she had to consider not just what was right, but what was possible, not just what she wanted to do, but what she could afford to do. "How long would it take our ships to get there?" she asked. 4 days if we push the engines to maximum. The crews would be exhausted when they arrived, but they'd be ready to fight. "And how many people did you say were on that planet?" 70 million, Madam President. Mostly civilians, families." President Barnes turned back to face the table. Morrison could see something change in her expression, a hardening of resolve that reminded him why he had voted for her twice. "General Martinez, how quickly can we mobilize the fleet?" "Ma'am, with respect, we haven't made a decision yet about whether—" "Yes, we have," the president said firmly. "I'm making it right now. Admiral Morrison, you have 12 hours to get every ship we have ready for departure. I want our fastest vessel to leave immediately with a message for the Zephyrians letting them know help is coming." Secretary Phillips looked shocked. "Madam President, the Council will condemn this action. We could face sanctions, trade restrictions, even military retaliation from the Hegemony." "Let them condemn it," Barnes said. "Let them impose sanctions. Let them try to retaliate. 70 million innocent people are about to die, and we're the only ones who seem to care enough to do something about it." Morrison felt pride swell in his chest. This was why he had dedicated his life to serving Earth and protecting human values. This was what made humanity different from all the other species in the galaxy. When faced with a choice between what was safe and what was right, they chose right. "Ma'am," said General Martinez carefully, "our people will die in this fight. Good people who have families of their own." President Barnes nodded slowly. "I know. And that weighs on me more than you can imagine. But sometimes the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of doing something. Sometimes you have to risk everything to save strangers, because if you don't, you're not the kind of people worth saving." She looked around the table at each of her advisors. "I won't order anyone to go. This will be a volunteer mission. But I suspect we'll have more volunteers than we have ships." Morrison smiled. "Actually, Madam President, the crews started volunteering about an hour ago. Word got out about the distress call, and I've had captains calling me all night asking to be included in the mission." "Then it's settled," Barnes said. "Admiral, send our message to the Zephyrians. Tell them humanity heard their call and we're coming. Tell them to hold on just a little longer." As the meeting broke up and the advisors hurried away to begin preparations, Morrison remained behind with the president. She was still staring at the hologram of New Haven, her face thoughtful. "Do you think we can really save them?" she asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. The odds were terrible and the enemy was strong. Many of his people would probably die in the attempt. But when he thought about those children hiding in bunkers, waiting for someone to care enough to help, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "Yes, ma'am. We're going to save them all." Captain Ryan cross-checked his navigation display for the 5th time in 10 minutes and still couldn't believe what he was seeing. The UES Endeavour was a small exploration ship, designed for peaceful scientific missions to study distant stars and planets. Her engines were built for efficiency, not speed, and her hull carried sensors and research equipment instead of weapons and armor. But somehow his little ship was racing through hyperspace faster than she had ever gone before, pushing toward the Kepler 442 system with a message that could change everything. The engineering crew had worked miracles to squeeze extra power from the drives, and Ryan could feel the ship shaking under the strain of maintaining such dangerous speeds. "Captain," called Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the navigation station, "we're getting some fluctuations in the hyperspace field. If we keep pushing this hard, we might lose containment." Ryan knew what that meant. A hyperspace field collapse would tear the ship apart in seconds, scattering atoms across several light years of empty space. But he also knew that 70 million people were dying while he raced to reach them. Every hour he saved might mean thousands of lives preserved. "How much longer can we maintain this speed?" he asked. "Maybe 6 hours, sir." "After that, the risk becomes too high." Ryan did the calculations in his head. 6 more hours would put them at the edge of the Zephyrian system, close enough to transmit their message but still outside the range of hegemony sensors. It would have to be enough. The message itself was stored in the ship's communication array, recorded by Admiral Morrison himself just before the Endeavour departed Earth. Ryan had listened to it during the journey, and each time it gave him chills. 27 words that carried the hopes of an entire species, and the promise of a civilization 37 light-years away. Meanwhile, in the Kepler 442 system, Admiral Thexmore stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Subjugator, watching the slow destruction of another Zephyrian city. The orbital bombardment had been going on for 3 months now, and his patience was wearing thin. The blue-scaled aliens should have surrendered weeks ago, but they kept fighting even as their world burned around them. "Status report," he ordered his tactical officer. "Sir, we've destroyed 60% of their military installations and 40% of their major population centers. Their planetary shields are failing in multiple sectors, and they've lost most of their orbital defenses." Thexmore nodded with satisfaction. The hegemony way of war was simple and effective. Apply overwhelming force until the enemy lost the will to resist, then demand total surrender. It had worked on 17 worlds so far, and it would work here too. "Any response to our latest surrender demand?" he asked. "No, sir. Commander Veltar continues to refuse our terms." "Then we continue the bombardment. Target their remaining hospitals and schools. Fear is more effective than anger when you want someone to give up." Deep beneath the surface of New Haven, Commander Veltar sat in the emergency command center that had become his home for the past 3 months. The walls shook constantly from the impacts above, and the air recycling system struggled to filter out the smoke and dust that leaked through damaged seals. "Sub-Commander." Kixara approached him with another casualty report. Her uniform was stained with dirt, and her scales had lost their natural shine from months of living underground. Everyone looked like they were slowly fading away, like shadows of the proud people they had once been. "Eastern District 7 is gone," she said quietly. "Direct hit on the elementary school. We got most of the children out, but the teachers—" She didn't finish the sentence. Veltar closed his eyes and added more names to the list that already held thousands of his people. Good people who had done nothing wrong except live on a world that someone else wanted to take. Teachers who had spent their lives helping children learn and grow, now dead because they had stayed behind to make sure their students escaped. "Sir," Junior Officer Nexali called from across the command center, "we're picking up some kind of transmission from the edge of the system. It's very faint, but it seems to be directed at us." Veltar felt a tiny spark of hope. For weeks they had been sending distress calls into the darkness, begging anyone who would listen to help them. Most had gone unanswered, and those that did respond offered only empty words of sympathy. "Can you clean up the signal?" he asked. "Working on it, sir." Most of our communication equipment was damaged in yesterday's attack, but I think I can filter out some of the interference. The three officers gathered around the communication console as Nexali worked to boost the signal. Slowly, through the static and interference, a voice emerged. It spoke Galactic Standard with an accent that none of them recognized, but the words were clear enough to understand. Attention, survivors of New Haven. This is Captain Ryan Cross of the United Earth ship Endeavor. You are not alone. Help is coming. The Terran Defense Fleet is en route to your position. Hold on just a little longer. Repeat, you are not alone. Help is coming. The command center fell silent except for the constant rumble of explosions from above. Veltar stared at the communication console, hardly daring to believe what he had heard. Earth. Humans. A species that most of the galaxy considered primitive and irrelevant. They were coming to help when no one else would. Earth? Kixara said with confusion in her voice. But they're nobody. They barely have hyperspace technology. What could they possibly do against a hegemony battle fleet? Veltar didn't know the answer, but he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from having no other choice, but the kind that comes from knowing someone cares enough to try. Get this message to every survivor shelter in the system, he ordered. Make sure everyone hears it. We need to let our people know that help is coming. Up in orbit, the crew of a hegemony monitoring station detected the transmission and immediately reported it to Admiral Thexmore. The Admiral listened to the message with amusement rather than concern. Humans. The newest members of the galactic community, barely advanced enough to reach their own star system's edge when he was born. Earth ships are coming to help the Zephyrians, his communication officer reported. Should we prepare for additional enemy vessels? Thexmore actually laughed. How many ships could they possibly send? Their entire fleet probably consists of a few dozen outdated vessels with primitive weapons. If they're foolish enough to interfere with hegemony operations, we'll destroy them and then finish glassing this planet as an example to others. But even as he dismissed the human threat, something about the transmission bothered him. There had been a confidence in the human captain's voice, a certainty that suggested they believed they could actually help. No species would send ships across dozens of light years unless they thought they had a chance of making a difference. Double our sensor sweeps, he ordered. I want to know the moment any human ships enter this system. And prepare a message for High Command. Tell them we may need to make an example of another species before this is over. Down on New Haven, the human message played again and again on every surviving communication channel. In underground shelters where Zephyrian families huddled together, children asked their parents who the humans were and why they were coming to help. Most parents didn't have good answers, but they could see something changing in the faces around them. For the first time in months, people were smiling. Not much and not for long, but it was a start. The message had given them something they had lost weeks ago. The belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Veltar stood in his command center listening to Captain Cross's voice repeat the same 27 words over and over. He didn't know how many ships the humans were sending or how they planned to fight a hegemony battle fleet. But he knew that someone had heard their cry for help and decided to answer it. That was enough. For now, that was enough to keep fighting for another day. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Washington and watched the tactical display as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. 26 ships, everything humanity could gather on short notice. Destroyers, cruisers, and 3 heavy battleships that represented the best Earth could build with their limited resources and young technology. The journey had taken 4 days of hard travel that pushed every engine to its limits. Some ships had suffered minor breakdowns along the way, but the crews had worked miracles to keep the fleet together. Now they were here 37 light years from home, about to face an enemy that had conquered 17 worlds and never known defeat. Admiral, called Commander Amy Scott from her position at the tactical station, I'm reading 53 hegemony vessels in orbit around New Haven, multiple battleships and heavy cruisers. They outgun us by at least 3-1. Morrison studied the enemy formation with the eye of someone who had spent 40 years learning how battles were won and lost. The hegemony ships were arranged in the classic pattern that most galactic militaries used: heavy vessels in the center, lighter ships on the flanks, support vessels in the rear. It was textbook strategy that had worked for centuries against enemies who fought the same way, but humans had learned to fight differently. Earth's short history had been filled with wars where smaller forces found ways to defeat larger ones through speed, surprise, and tactics that their enemies never expected. Morrison's fleet might be outnumbered, but it wasn't outthought. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison," he broadcast on the fleet communication channel. "Take formation Delta 7 and prepare for combat operations. Remember, we're not here to play by their rules. We're here to win." On the bridge of the subjugator, Admiral Thexmore watched the human fleet appear on his sensors with something between amusement and annoyance. 26 ships against his 53. Small vessels with primitive weapons against the most advanced military force in the galaxy. It would be over in minutes. "Human vessels," he transmitted on an open channel. "You are entering a restricted military zone. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed." The response came back almost instantly, delivered by a human with a calm voice that showed no trace of fear. "Admiral Thexmore, this is Admiral Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Fleet. You have exactly 1 hour to cease your bombardment and withdraw from this system." Thexmore actually laughed out loud, causing several of his bridge officers to look at him in surprise. The human was threatening him. This primitive species that had barely mastered hyperspace travel was giving orders to a hegemony admiral who commanded more firepower than most entire star systems could muster. "You dare threaten me with your handful of primitive ships?" Thexmore replied. "Human, you will watch your fleet burn and then watch as I finish destroying this planet." "I don't think so," came Morrison's calm response, and the transmission cut off. What Admiral Thexmore didn't understand was that human military doctrine had been shaped by centuries of fighting on a world where resources were limited and enemies were clever. Earth's nations had learned that winning wasn't about having the biggest army. It was about using what you had more effectively than your opponent used what they had. The human ships began to move in patterns that made no sense to hegemony tactical doctrine. Instead of forming battle lines and advancing toward the enemy, they scattered in all directions like leaves blown by a strong wind. Some ships accelerated toward the hegemony fleet while others moved away from it. A few began complex spiraling movements that served no obvious purpose. "What are they doing?" Thexmore demanded of his tactical officer. "Unknown, sir. Their formation appears to be completely random. They're not following any recognized battle doctrine." Morrison's plan was based on something the hegemony had never encountered, an enemy that refused to fight the way battles were supposed to be fought. While Thexmore's ships maintained their traditional formation and waited for the humans to attack, the Terran fleet was implementing tactics that would have been impossible for any other species to coordinate. Captain Susan Clark of the destroyer UES Nashville led the first element of Morrison's plan. Her ship and 5 others had been modified during the journey with experimental equipment that allowed them to make precise micro-jumps within a star system. The technology was dangerous and unreliable, but it gave them capabilities that no other species possessed. "All right, people," she announced to her crew as they prepared to engage. "We're about to show these aliens why Earth is still here after all the wars we've fought. Remember, we don't have to be stronger than them. We just have to be smarter." The Nashville and her companion ship suddenly vanished from the hegemony sensors, reappearing seconds later directly behind the enemy formation. Before the surprised aliens could react, the human ships opened fire on the support vessels that kept the hegemony fleet supplied and coordinated. Thexmore watched in shock as 6 of his logistics ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. The human vessels disappeared again before his gunners could target them, only to reappear in a completely different location and destroy 3 more ships. "How are they doing that?" he shouted. "Ships that small shouldn't be able to make hyperspace jumps with such precision." But the real surprise was yet to come. As the hegemony fleet tried to regroup and respond to the hit-and-run attacks, the rest of Morrison's plan unfolded. Captain Pete Rodriguez of the cruiser UES Phoenix led 12 ships in a frontal assault that drew the attention of every hegemony gunner. The alien ships opened fire with everything they had, filling space with deadly plasma beams and missile swarms. But the human ships didn't try to fight through the barrage. Instead, they used their superior speed and maneuverability to dance between the enemy weapons, striking at weak points in vulnerable systems while avoiding direct confrontation. Morrison himself led the final element of the attack from the bridge of the Washington. While the hegemony fleet was distracted by the other 2 groups, he took his remaining ships on a course that seemed to be retreating from the battle. The aliens barely paid attention to them. focused as they were on the immediate threats. That was exactly what Morrison had hoped for. His ship swung wide around the battle, using the gravity of New Haven's largest moon to accelerate them toward their real target, the orbital bombardment platforms that had been raining death on the planet below for 3 months. "All ships," Morrison announced as they approached the platforms. "You wanted to see what humans do when innocent people are in trouble. Now you know, we don't send diplomats. We don't form committees. We come ourselves, and we don't leave until the job is done." The bombardment platforms were heavily armed but designed to attack stationary targets on a planet's surface, not fast-moving ships in space. The human fleet tore through them like a storm wind through paper, destroying in minutes the weapons that had terrorized the Zephyrian civilians for months. Down on New Haven, Commander Veltar felt the ground stop shaking for the first time in 3 months. The constant rumble of explosions from above had become so familiar that the sudden silence seemed strange and wrong. Then the communication console in his command center came alive with reports from across the planet. "The bombardment has stopped," Kixara said with wonder in her voice. "All of it. Every platform is either destroyed or silent." Veltar looked up at the ceiling as if he could see through miles of rock to the battle raging in space above them. Somewhere up there, humans who had never met a Zephyrian were fighting and dying to protect people they had no obligation to save. "Get me a line to the human fleet," he ordered. "I want to thank them personally." The response came back within minutes, delivered by the same calm voice that had promised help was coming. "Commander Veltar, this is Admiral Morrison. We'll stay until Galactic Council forces arrive. No one's going to hurt your people while we're here." For the first time in months, Veltar smiled. Admiral Thexmore stared at his tactical display in complete disbelief as another 3 of his ships exploded in brilliant balls of fire. In 30 years of military service, he had never seen anything like what the human fleet was doing to his carefully organized formation. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking at his weakest points and vanishing before his gunners could respond. "Damage report," he ordered his tactical officer, though he could see the numbers for himself on the display. "Sir, we've lost 18 ships including the heavy cruiser Dominator and 2 supply vessels. The humans have lost only 1 destroyer. Their tactics are unlike anything in our combat databases." Texmore felt something he had never experienced before in battle: uncertainty. The hegemony way of war was simple and had worked for centuries. Line up your ships, use superior firepower to destroy the enemy, then demand surrender. But these humans refused. To fight that way, and his traditional tactics were useless against their strange methods. Captain Susan Clark watched from the bridge of the UES Nashville as her ship prepared for another micro-jump attack. The experimental technology was holding together better than anyone had hoped, though the engineering crew reported dangerous stress levels in the hyperspace generators. They might get 2 or 3 more jumps before the system failed completely. "Target their command ship," she ordered her weapons officer. "If we can take out their flagship, the rest of their fleet might lose coordination." The Nashville and her companion ships vanished from normal space and reappeared directly above the subjugator. For a few precious seconds, they had a clear shot at the Hegemony Admiral's bridge before enemy weapons could target them. Clark's gunners fired everything they had, sending missiles and plasma beams into the massive ship's upper sections. The attack didn't destroy the subjugator, but it did something almost as valuable. Thexmore's bridge lost power for nearly a minute, cutting off his communications with the rest of the fleet. When the emergency systems restored basic functions, he found his carefully organized formation falling apart as ship captains tried to respond to the human attacks without clear orders. "Get me fleet communications," he shouted at his technical staff. "I need to regain control of this battle." But the battle was already beyond his control. Captain Pete Rodriguez led his cruiser squadron in a sweeping attack that targeted the Hegemony ship's weapon systems, instead of trying to destroy them completely. It was a tactic that confused the alien captains who expected enemies to either run away or fight to the death. "Why aren't they trying to kill us?" one Hegemony captain transmitted to the flagship. "They're just disabling our guns and moving on to the next target." Rodriguez could have answered that question if he had heard it. Human military doctrine emphasized achieving objectives with minimum casualties when possible. The goal wasn't to slaughter the Hegemony fleet, but to stop them from attacking innocent civilians. Dead enemies couldn't surrender. but enemies who had lost their weapons could be convinced to leave. Admiral Morrison coordinated the entire battle from the bridge of the Washington, watching as his three-part plan unfolded exactly as he had hoped. The hit-and-run attacks kept the enemy confused and off balance, while the direct assault prevented them from reorganizing their formation. Meanwhile, the destruction of the bombardment platforms had achieved their primary objective, protecting the civilians on New Haven. "Admiral," Commander Scott reported, "the hegemony fleet is trying to withdraw to a defensive position near the system's outer planets. Should we pursue?" Morrison considered the tactical situation. His ships had performed better than anyone had expected, but they were still outnumbered by more than 2-1. Pursuing a retreating enemy into open space would give the hegemony the kind of direct confrontation they preferred and understood. "Negative," he decided. "We hold position around New Haven. Our job is to protect the planet, not chase enemy ships across the system." Down on the planet's surface, the silence that had replaced months of constant bombardment felt strange and wonderful to the Zephyrian survivors. For the first time since the siege began, children could play in the underground shelters without flinching at every sound. Parents could sleep without wondering if they would wake up to find their world destroyed. Commander Veltar stood in his command center receiving reports from every district on the planet. The news was better than he had dared to hope for weeks. Medical teams were able to move freely between shelters for the first time in months. Engineers were starting preliminary repairs on the planetary shield generators. Most importantly, the casualty reports had stopped growing. "Sir," Sub-Commander Kixara said with something like joy in her voice, "we're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Council. 3 member fleets are en route to our position and should arrive within 6 days. Veltar felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. 6 days. The Council had finally decided to act after 3 months of debate and committee meetings. If the humans hadn't come when they did, there would have been nothing left for the Council fleets to save. "What about the human fleet?" he asked. "Admiral Morrison says they'll maintain defensive positions until the Council forces arrive. He wants to make sure the hegemony doesn't try another attack while we're still vulnerable." High above the planet, Admiral Thexmore faced the most difficult decision of his career. His fleet had lost nearly a third of its ships to an enemy that should have been no threat at all. The bombardment platforms that had given him leverage over the planet were gone. Worst of all, his reputation as an undefeated commander was in ruins. "Admiral," his communication officer reported, "High Command is demanding a full report on the situation. They want to know how a primitive human fleet was able to defeat our forces." Thexmore didn't have a good answer to that question. On paper, his ships were superior in every measurable way. They had stronger shields, more powerful weapons, and crews trained from childhood for warfare. But the humans had something that wasn't in any technical manual: the ability to think in ways that their enemies couldn't predict. "Send a message to High Command," he finally ordered. "Tell them that further operations in this system would be inadvisable. The humans have proven more capable than our intelligence reports suggested. It wasn't a surrender, but it was as close to one as a hegemony admiral could come." Thexmore ordered his remaining ships to withdraw to the edge of the system where they would wait and watch but not attack. The siege of New Haven was over. 3 days later, Captain Ryan Cross of the UES Endeavour sat in the observation lounge of his ship and watched the first Galactic Council vessels arrive in the system. They were impressive ships, larger and more advanced than anything in the human fleet. But they had arrived too late to help when help was needed. Most, Cross thought about the message he had carried across 37 light years of space and how those 27 words had given hope to an entire world. The Galactic Council would file reports and hold hearings about what had happened here. They would probably pass resolutions condemning the hegemony and praising the heroic defense of New Haven. But Cross knew the real story was simpler than any official report would say. When innocent people called for help in the darkness, humanity had answered. Not because they had to, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Word of the Battle of New Haven spread through the galaxy faster than the fastest ships could carry it. The story grew with each telling, but the basic facts remained the same. A small human fleet had saved an entire world from destruction, fighting against impossible odds and winning through courage and cleverness. Other species began to look at humanity with new respect. The young civilization from the galactic rim had proven that they belonged among the stars not because of their technology or their wealth, but because of their willingness to stand up for what was right even when it cost them everything. And in the darkness between the stars, other voices began calling for help, knowing now that someone would always answer.